Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean. It's 4:30 a.m. and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Ten years ago, I wasn't painting watercolors. I knew very little about photography. And even at work, my output was a lot slower and lesser than it is today. Is it just a passage of time that makes all the difference? Or is it a system of learning? I think both factors matter. But the second one, the method of learning, that's what makes all the difference. Most of all, the method of learning you choose keeps you on track. And it allows for distractions, because distractions are needed. To ignore distractions is a fool's game. Distractions are all around us, and it's smarter to learn how to manage them rather than to eliminate them completely. Let's get down that road, shall we, and find out how we can use these 3 methods of learning to help us along our way. These are 3 methods that I've used, and I think quite effectively, and those are the 3 topics we're going to cover today. The first is why dual tasking is often superior to focused learning. The second is apps that distract and why it helps to put a restriction on them. And finally, using geolocation to get into learning mode. Let's start out with why dual tasking is often far superior to focused learning. Does multitasking make you better at the task or worse? David Strayer is a professor of psychology at the University of Utah and studies attention, how it works and how it doesn't. His research didn't seem at first to come up with any breathtaking news. If anything, one factor was consistent. No matter how people insisted that they were good at multitasking, they were hopeless. Every time someone switched to another task, the first task suffered. Even when dealing with hands-free devices, reaction time slowed and attention decreased. Yet, hidden in his research were something of a surprise. About 2.5% of the research group were supertaskers. Due to some slight genetic variation, a very tiny subset of people do much better when multitasking than when performing a single task alone. So yes, there are people who are exceedingly good, but they're a very, very tiny percentage. Most of us, we're completely hopeless at it. Even so, it might be important to invent a term called dual tasking. When you look at multitasking, it concentrates on the level of attention. It rigidly looks at the attention you give to one task in comparison with another, which suggests that both functions are incredibly demanding. When driving, for example, we may fool ourselves. We may think, okay, we can control the car, we have the hands-free speaker on, we can have a chat, it's not distracting us, we can see the road, we have no accident. And yet, when you look at the statistics, about 28% of all deaths and accidents on highways, it had to do with distraction. People, drivers, on their phones. So no, you shouldn't drink and drive or talk and drive or juggle and drive. However, when doing low-intensity tasks, you may not need the same level of attentiveness. Take, for instance, something that I do almost every single day. As you probably know, after breakfast, I sit down at the dining table and I paint my watercolor diary for about 20 to 30 minutes. I'm relatively practiced at both sketching and painting, which means that at least part of my brain can easily handle another activity. I could listen to a podcast or I could watch something on YouTube. And more often than not, I will watch comedy, or I'll learn something. In the past 3 or 4 weeks alone, I've finished entire video courses in photography. One by Nigel Danson on landscapes, one by Steve McCurry, and the third by Joel Meyerowitz, all while sketching or painting. That's 118 videos in all, and this is while doing another task. Part of the reason why this form of dual tasking is possible is that both of the jobs are low intensity, and instead of trying to stop and make notes and implement the information, I go through the entire course, the entire overview. And if some chapters or videos are particularly exciting or require repeated viewing, then I merely make a note of the sections so I can come back. But I don't stop, I just keep moving on. To some, this activity of going from start to finish may seem reasonably pointless. Yet you stop and think about it. Think about how many courses you've finished recently. How many audiobooks lie unfinished on your device? What if you could effectively do something else? Another low-intensity activity. And that could get you right to the end of the course. The sense of completion itself is a great achievement, but there is this added advantage. You've now got a solid overview of the material, and you know which parts were confusing and which parts needed more attention. And that's when your focus comes into play. Having skimmed through the entire course, you can now dig deep into the bits that matter to you. And I tend to go through parts of a course twice or thrice. In some cases, I've watched the same video as many as 14 times. I grapple and I try to implement the ideas. It has enabled me to improve my skills in writing in various aspects of software, languages, art, as well as my newfound love of photography. So let's be clear about it. Multitasking is usually pointless. It's often dangerous, but dual tasking works, especially when you're dealing with low-intensity tasks. But of course, dual tasking isn't for everyone. You might find watching a video or listening to a podcast highly distracting. Yet, it's something worth trying, if only for a short while. And as we go through life, we find our to learn and our to implement list getting bigger and longer and more crazier all the time. And to stay rooted in a method that we've used, which is non-distracting, and yet it's not working, that isn't the way to move ahead. Even so, there will be times when you need to focus, and no amount of advice from some big shot is going to help. Take, for instance, the very activity I do today, which is watercolors. Today I can happily draw and paint while listening to video or audio or someone speaking to me. But if you go back about 10 years ago, I just couldn't stand any kind of activity, any kind of noise, anyone speaking to me. If you entered the room, I would tell you to be quiet. And that's how it went. I had to focus, but now I'm fine. And now I don't have to focus so much on that, so I can add a second activity and do both of them, as long as they're both low intensity. The reality of life is that we don't have time. We haven't had more time, and we're not going to get more time. And that if we just dig in our heels and go, this is the way I've always done it, well, it hasn't worked before. And that's what I had to do. I had to put in these low-level dual activities together. And that's how I started to add all of these different learning things together, like Lego blocks. And now we've got a little castle going. So that's the first thing that helped me and still continues to help me learn better. But the second thing is it goes the opposite way. It's distraction. And on those phones and on those tablets, we have distractions. Apps that distract. Let's find out how to deal with them. Broadly speaking, there are two types of apps. One is the scrolling app, and the second is the non-scrolling app. If you look at the apps that are generally the most significant waste of time, they all fall into the first category. They're the scrolling app. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. They're all of the apps that chew up a lot of time in our day. Back in 2006, a technology engineer, Asa Raskin, invented what is called the infinite scroll. And today, he regrets it. If you don't give your brain enough time to catch up with your impulses, you just keep scrolling. That's what Raskin said. And apps that are scrolling apps, the apps that have the infinite scroll, that's where we tend to waste most of our time in the day. And it's not enough to put a restriction of apps. I own an iPhone, I own an iPad, and they will send you a weekly report on how much time you spent on your device. In the first week or two, you will feel bad about how much time you've been wasting, but you see your usage go right down and then go up after that. And the biggest reason why the weekly report doesn't restrain you is because it's based on everything that you do on your device. For instance, I draw on the iPad Pro. When I'm watching a movie on Netflix, I tend to draw and I tend to color at least 2 or 3 cartoons. So the software that measures my usage doesn't distinguish between productive work and wasted time. Hence, when I get the report of higher usage at the end of the week, I know it's easy to ignore. And that's the problem. You and I don't need a summary of all of our usage. We don't need to see all of it. We need just the report on the scrolling apps. Or better still, to nip that usage in the bud. A report is like shutting the barn door after the horse has bolted. A more effective way to avoid the distraction on your app is to restrict the app usage itself. I'm not sure if there is a method to do so on the Android, but you can quite easily do so on the iPhone or iPad. I simply go into the settings, I find Facebook for instance, and I put in a time limit of 15 minutes. 15 minutes every day. Now if you add Twitter and Pinterest and whatever, Instagram, you're still going through an hour every single day. Often that leads nowhere, but at least you know. You're done with that hour and you're done for that day. You can override the app, but it's a nuisance. I tried it, I know. You can override it. It allows you to override it, but it just becomes annoying after a while. And what that does is it signals to you visibly and physically that you're spending a lot of time on these apps, on these scrolling apps. What you have when you're not scrolling is more time to do other things, like I paint or learn photography, or I stay focused on my work. Or better still, you can head to the non-scrolling apps like Procreate, which is used for drawing, or a mind map, or whatever other stuff you're doing. And the non-scrolling apps is where it becomes productive. It's not as if to say the scrolling apps are useless. You want to be distracted sometime in the day. Who's going to work continuously? That's crazy. But you want to have that restriction. Just like you'd do if you had kids. You'd put a restriction and you'd enforce that restriction. And if you're going to do that for your kids, you might as well do it for yourself. And that's my second learning technique, at least recently. The first one was not about multitasking, but dual tasking. Doing 2 low-intensity tasks at the same time. And the second one, that was about this app restriction, specific scrolling apps being restricted. And the third one, we're going to look at geolocation and how it helps you get into that framework where you're ready to learn. Right next to the Japanese restaurant that we frequent, there is a playground. Which means that if we're going to dinner with my nieces Marsha and Kara, we invariably end up on the playground after dinner. If, on the other hand, we go to the Indian restaurant, there are 0 demands for the playground activity. Why? Because, as you'd suspect, there is no playground anywhere close to the Indian restaurant. In short, The type of activity is being facilitated by the environment, which roughly speaking is geolocation. Geolocation means where you are and what's around you. And if you use that kind of learning, geolocation learning, then essentially you're putting yourself in a spot where you're ready to do a specific activity. Take, for instance, one of my favorite authors, William Dalrymple. He writes about history, Indian history. And when he's writing his book, he is known to leave New Delhi, where he lives, and head up to Rajasthan, to a specific hotel, and he writes his historical bestsellers. An activity that involves putting yourself in a particular location to write, that's not foreign to most of us, but it's a valuable tactic that gets a whole other bunch of activities going. For instance, by sitting down at the dining table to paint after breakfast, well, that's paid dividends because I've been able to do about 2,500 to 3,000 pages of art. And when you think about it, all the elements matter. It's the book, the paints, the time of day, the breakfast, and most of all, the location. Now that's just a hobby, that's painting, but what about work? If I need to plan for this podcast, then I will head to a cafe nearby, and usually at around 2 p.m. That way I can get 2 precise hours before the cafe closes. The trick, at least for me, is to find different locations for separate activities. There are no shortage of good cafes in Auckland, which means that I'll pick one cafe for planning, another for writing, a third for reading, and so on. And while I'm charging the car, yes, I drive an electric, I will meditate, or I'll complete my day one photo diary. So what's happening is all of these locations are triggering off something. When I go to this cafe, something happens. When I go to charge the car, that happens. And all of these different things, they're all acting as triggers. Now, it's not essential to leave your office or your home to achieve these goals. Even if you live in a relatively small home, you can use different locations, different rooms to do specific tasks, or even different desks or sofas, or even sitting on the ground, if that's what you do. And the very fact that you're allocating a space signals to your brain that you're in that location for a specific reason. And this is intense because your brain knows you're there for one reason. The reality of life is that most of us find it hard to keep learning. Information keeps pummeling at us like a solar storm, and yet we have to do our best to stay somewhat on top of things. We can't ever catch up with the knowledge stream, and we really never could. But it does help to do what we can, and sitting in one place may at first seem very practical, yet it doesn't engage the brain. Distraction soon sets in. A different location, and especially one that is designated to do a specific activity, is probably a better idea. Even if you've rented a co-working space, it's better to just spend a little of that time and then go out to the garden, to the beach, to the library, to the cafe, any place, even a different chair in their room, and then you get a different task done. Geolocation, it's a powerful trigger. It's talked about in books like Why We Learn by Benedict Carey, about how kids learn better when you move them to different parts of the room, literally. So it's not just some fancy stuff that we've made up. It is there in science, in learning. You might want to read that book at some point in time. Maybe I'll even cover it in a podcast. It's Why We Learn by Benedict Carey. Geolocation is a powerful trigger to learn, to implement things. Use it to your advantage. My niece Kira sure does. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Time to do a summary. We started out with dual tasking. We found that multitasking, that's always been a myth. There are super taskers and there's the rest of us. But dual tasking is like a violinist. When you look at a violinist, a kid learning to play the violin, they are concentrating and there's this focus. And how does the teacher know that that violinist has made it? Not necessarily just by the fact that they're playing. But then the teacher goes up to speak to their violinist and they can play while speaking to the teacher. And that shows you that there isn't so much pressure, so much concentration needed on the violin part or the speaking part. What we have here is a dual tasking kind of situation. And you have a lot of things that you can dual task on. You don't have to do several things, just one or two things side by side. So dual tasking, try that. That's the first thing that we covered. The second thing is the factor of distraction. It's all around us. There's no point in saying, oh, I'm not going to be distracted. Of course you're going to be distracted. What we need is to understand the difference between scrolling apps and non-scrolling apps. And the scrolling apps, they're the problem cases. So go after them. Go and find out all your scrolling apps, put a time restriction, or just delete the apps. I have certain apps on my iPhone and certain apps don't exist on the iPad. So I can't scroll while I'm lying in bed or doing stuff like that. So there are distractions and there are location type distractions, which we didn't talk about, but I'm just bringing it up right now. So just go after the scrolling apps. That's the summary for this episode anyway. And finally, geolocation. If you're training kids, well, geolocation is a science. But for you as well, going to a cafe, going to another chair, going to another room, garden, library, allocate spaces for learning time, allocate spaces for doing or implementing stuff. Not exactly the same space, as you can tell, different spaces. So that when you get there, you're there for a specific reason. Just like you go to the cafe for a coffee or for a tea or for a lemon juice, whatever it is that you're drinking. There is a geolocation. You know you're going to do that because that's why you're there in the first place. If you use the same space, the brain is easily distracted. Learning doesn't happen. Well, we're back to square one. But we can get out of that trap just by geolocating what our activities are going to be. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. I'm recording this podcast in advance because I'm headed to India. It's my mother's 75th birthday and, well, that's where I'm going. And today's the 29th of Feb. If this podcast goes out on time, it's the 29th of Feb. We're in a leap year. What do you know? So we get one extra day in February. And it gives you one extra day to think about the article writing course. Now, one of the biggest problems that I had was article writing. It just drove me insane. It was the most demanding, difficult task. And I could never guarantee that at the end of it, the article was going to be any good for me or for anybody else. And I think there are certain things like drawing or writing or walking. These are like fundamental to human beings to be able to communicate, to move around, to get from A to B. And it drove me crazy. Yesterday, I wrote 3 articles in one morning. I couldn't do that. I was chatting with Simon Lamy, who had also done the home study of the article writing course. And I said to him that, going back in time, I wouldn't be able to write those 3 articles in fewer than 2 weeks or longer. And I wouldn't know how they would turn out. And now I know. And now most of the people who have done the article writing course, they know for sure. This is the amount of time it's going to take. It's going to take between 45 minutes and an hour. It's going to be of this quality because there is a structure in place. There is a guidance system. It's like a GPS. It's not some, go write something. So anyway, that was me getting all excited. But 21st March, that's when you can get your booking for the article writing live. And this live course means 3 months of writing 5 days a week. So it's pretty intense. You could call it the article writing intensive, if you want to call it that. And then if you want something that's more laid back in a way, because you don't have to show up and be on a forum and get your work corrected, well, then there's the home study. And it's considerably cheaper than the live course. So 21st March and 28th of March, that's for the live and for the home study version. Now, you can get all of this stuff, and you have to be on the waiting list because the waiting list gets the notification before everybody else. So it's a priority system. 5,000 BC members get first preference, and often all the seats are taken before because we have only 25 seats, I think, or 20 seats for the live course. So live course and the home study have these very limited number of seats or products that we are selling. And so 5,000 BC members get first preference, then you get on the waiting list, and then everybody else, if there's everybody else. So get to the waiting list. That's psychotactics.com/AW goodies. And AW stands for article writing. So you'll get goodies anyway, but it also gives you a chance to sign up for the course if you choose to do so. And since this is a new year, and if you find yourself scrambling around, well, there is chaos planning. So go to psychotactics.com and deal with chaos in a way that chaos is your friend. Most of us try to look at apps, try to look at chaos like as if it doesn't exist. But this book is written specifically to deal with chaos as your friend. That friend is going to show up every day at 12 o'clock. And how you're going to deal with it. So how do you plan your day when chaos is an integral part of it, which it is a part of for all of us? So chaos planning, that's something that you could look at, especially as we go through the new year, even though right now almost in the third month. That's pretty much it from leap year and February 29th. And I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye.